I can remember a piercing ring from the kitchen radio. It stopped abruptly, followed by a broadcaster's voice. "You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister." These ominous words made my father lower his newspaper, and my mother immediately stopped fussing over the dishes. "I speak to you now from 10 Downing Street," a grave voice stated. "Over the course of last night, a major incident has occurred stemming from a home in Fermy Park Road in Crouch End, London, claiming the lives of 36 civilians and 20 men of service. The effect of this incident has spread throughout the Crouch End area, and measures have been taken to evacuate civilians. Henceforth, a section of the North London area will be quarantined, and a military presence will be held at its borders to safeguard London and its people. We have yet to understand the nature of this incident, but rest assured a global effort is in place to research and ameliorate its effects. In this time of uncertainty, have faith that your government is doing everything in its power to protect its people. With a heavy heart we will mourn those that have passed in this darkest of nights, and with courage we shall prevail against the unknown. Of what little memories I have to cling to now, this I know is the earliest. No matter how hard I try, pacing around this white, sterile cell I now reside in, I can only recollect events relating to that awful place. London's glaring scar on its otherwise beautiful face, the exclusion zone. It took some adjustment, but eventually people became accustomed to seeing the 40-foot concrete walls and the constant armed patrols. It was a reminder that there were still some things in this world we couldn't comprehend, and there was an unspoken agreement that it was better to not dwell on it. So the years went by, the walls became a staple in the lives of Londoners, and yet we were no closer to understanding the events that put them there. Aerial footage showed nothing apart from a large, almost perfect circle of dead vegetation surrounding the epicenter of the zone. But apart from that, there were no observable signs of activity. That's why we were sent in, me, along with 4 men I've served with for years, and a handful of scientists from across the world were sent to participate in the first manned expedition of the exclusion zone. It seems funny now after everything that had happened, but on the drive from RAF Northolt to the zone, we were in good spirits. We were doing something that hadn't been done before, and for a group of lifelong military men, this could very well have been the pinnacle of our careers. I was driving the large Foxhound at the rear of the convoy, packed in with the rest of the military escort for the expedition. Beside me was Amar Sandhu, a Sikh field medic and my closest friend, with the patience of a saint and the bedside manners to match. Behind us in the rear passenger seats were Richard Ames, a true Scouser who never failed to lighten a conversation, and the stone-faced John Rowland, a Glasgow man through and through. Ahead of us leading the charge was a canvas-covered truck driven by Captain Edward Harp, carrying all the expedition's equipment, and Doctors Olga Filipova, Ian Shellberg and Michael Coolidge. There was an atmosphere of subdued excitement in that vehicle, but as the shadow of those behemoth walls were cast over us, as those thick, rusted steel gates creaked open for the first time in 30 years, swallowing the truck ahead, that feeling was sucked out of us in an instant. What was left was a quiet dread and an anticipation for an unforeseen threat lurking behind those walls, undisturbed until now. Ghost towns aren't anything new. There are countless pictures of buildings and roads reclaimed by nature after they're discarded by their past inhabitants, so the sight of ivy-covered walls and weeds bursting from asphalt didn't surprise us as we finally rolled through those gates. What did send a cold shiver down my spine was the view of the wall's interior from my wing mirror. At the base of the wall were piles of animal carcasses. Deep scratches covered the foot of the concrete palisade. In some spots, jutting from the mess of dull orange fox furs and withered rat tails, I could see the faint glint of name tags and collars. I was snapped out of any superstitious thoughts when I saw Olga's head stick out of the truck's window ahead of us to snap a photo of the animals. Rumors be damned, we were there to do a job, and I wouldn't let my imagination get in the way of a mission. We traversed a good distance down that cracked, unmaintained road when Amar finally broke the silence. "So, friends, what do you think happened here?" "Gas," Richie replied, in an unapologetically confident tone. "Has to be, lad. Gas line burst in the night. Leaked into the air, making people go crazy." "Oh, it's always bloody gas with you," John said. "A car exploded while we're in Bosnia, an active war zone, and you thought it was gas. It's never gas." "All right, you tell me what it was then if you're so smart," Richie replied. "Doesn't matter what it was. That's for them to figure out," John said, nodding towards the truck. "I'm afraid he's right, Amar," I said, glancing to my left. "We're the only ones here not paid to think. Probably better not to wonder about these things." Just as that enlightening conversation finished, we passed into the last of the remaining flora in the zone. In an instant, our surroundings changed from that of a lush urban forest to a dry wasteland. There were no more trees, no weeds, nothing to indicate we were in London instead of some abandoned gold rush town. The odd thing was that everything looked so clean, like the entire area was perfectly frozen in a time long gone. It didn't take long in that place for my stomach to turn. At the time, I reasoned it away as nerves, pushed it to the back of my mind and focused on the road ahead. It was this focus that made me notice it. Of all the near-identical street lamps lining the road that we had passed so far, the one approaching the vehicle to the right was just a foot shorter than the rest. It was identical to its neighbours in every way, except for the fact that it seemed to have sank into the footpath, tilting slightly forward. "How much longer do we have, Lewis?" Richie said, clearly looking uneasy in his seat. "I'm dying for a shit." That statement pulled my attention away from the road. I realized what started as a slight sinking feeling in my stomach had progressed into a full-blown cramp, like my insides were twisting into a knot, threatening to burst at any moment. "Sure it not just gas," John said quietly. The two-way radio cracked to life, and Captain Harp's voice came through. "EV2, this is EV1. Prepare to make a brief stop. Dr. Filipova and Dr. Shellberg need to take some readings." He paused for a moment. "And Dr. Coolidge is after getting sick." We pulled onto the hard shoulder and dispersed to go about our respective duties. Pulling out my binoculars, I scouted out the road ahead, seeing something peculiar in the dead center. Half a car, more specifically its rear half, boot pointed to the sky. Once soil samples were collected and environmental readings were taken, we approached this oddity. As we got closer, it dawned on me that it wasn't half a car. It was a full one, dipped headfirst into the road, merging seamlessly with the asphalt. A black, desiccated hand hung out of the rear passenger window. There were no cracks, no sinkholes. It was as if the car was dipped into a liquid road, filling the car, drowning its unfortunate driver, before drying and hardening around it. I approached with tentative confusion. Olga was absolutely beaming with curiosity. After taking a tissue sample from the late driver, she jogged around the back of the truck, rummaged through some crates, and produced a pill bottle. Distributing the capsules to the team, she explained that they were only taking probiotics and that she would prefer to wait until she had solid evidence before she explained her theory. I took the pill gladly. I would have taken anything at that point if it stopped the ceaseless churning in my stomach. We turned off the main road and soon found ourselves in a quaint residential street. Red brick townhouses lined the road, the effects of the phenomena evident wherever I looked. Emergency vehicles phased into one another, street bins lodged into the sides of buildings. 3 floors up, it was hard not to get whiplash, seeing these nonsensical scenes in the middle of an otherwise perfect snapshot of a quiet London neighborhood in the 70s. Amar turned to me and spoke quietly. "You know why I asked that question earlier, Lewis?" "I don't know, small talk," I replied. No, my friend, it's because I knew we were all trying not to think about it, pushing it back into a dark place. I needed to ask that question to bring it to the light. We can't go into this place fearing the shadows. Our negative thoughts would only do harm. Believe what you will, but pushing further with confidence and positivity is the only way, facing it head first. He was right, of course, he always was. We parked in front of a community centre on the street corner. This was to be our base of operations. I was busy pulling crates from the truck, carrying experimental equipment I could never hope to understand the purpose of, when I looked down the street facing me. A completely unassuming neighborhood, and there tucked in a row of buildings identical to it, was the focal point of our mission. Number 32, Ferme Park Road, the epicenter of the phenomena. We would conduct a thorough search of it the next day, but for now I turned away and focused on the preparation work. I was finishing setting up my cot on the polished linoleum floor when I grabbed the attention of Dr. Ian Shellberg. As a world-renowned physicist and the lead researcher of the expedition, I was hoping he could shed some light on the vast array of antennas, cables and clunky machinery we had been setting up around the area that day. His answer was disappointing and frankly made me question the point of the expedition. If I'm being honest, no one really knows what to look for here. I have some theories, but it's grasping at straws at best. The goal here is to cast a very wide net, combining run-of-the-mill environmental sensors with cutting-edge equipment from the very fringe of experimental physics. And if we're lucky, we may catch something, he explained. It wasn't what I was hoping for, but to give him credit, we were all starved of information. Whatever happened that night stopped that night, leaving no measurable evidence apart from the slowly growing dead zone. That evening, Amar cooked for us on a portable gas stove. We were sat in a small circle enjoying the meal when Olga approached with a concerned look. "Captain, I suggest you mandate daily probiotics from now on," she stated. We all looked up from our plates. I inspected the tissue sample from the body we encountered. I also gave myself a mouth swab to double-check, but... She paused, not knowing how to possibly explain. There was an unusually low amount of bacteria. What little I could see under the microscope was all moving in the same direction. I don't think life around the epicenter is dying. I think it's leaving. Ugh. At that moment, we were all visibly jarred, none more than Michael. "We can't stay here," he blurted, rocking in his seat. "We're messing with forces we can't possibly comprehend." "That's enough, Doctor," Captain Harp responded. "It's true we can't afford to delay the mission now, but we're here for a reason. We'll inspect the house tomorrow and get whatever data we can. At least we've set up a line of communication to the outside. I'll update command, and I suggest you all get a good night's rest." No rest came that night. The thought of being one of the first ones in that house tomorrow, accompanied with Michael's ceaseless tossing and mumbling, kept me from sleep. Morning couldn't come quick enough, but when it did, I got dressed, packed my gear and prepared for the task ahead. The first pass of the house was to be conducted by myself, Richie and John. We weren't tasked with much, just to clear every corner, making sure there were no glaring hazards, anomalies or threats of any kind. I remember thinking the simplicity of the job was overstated. We were entering ground zero of a world-famous disaster, hidden from view and left untouched for years, the unholiest of holies. We suited up in thick, lead-lined hazmat suits and entered the decontamination chamber we had set up in front of the door the previous day. Behind us were our team and the outside world. In front of us was a freshly painted door to the unknown, complete with a shiny brass knocker and the number 32 bolted to its center. We stood in dead silence, listening to the sharp hiss of chemicals spraying our suits. After a quick blast of air to dry us off and the ringing of a buzzer, the captain's voice came through our suits' internal speakers. "You are clear to enter. Good luck, men." The air inside was heavy, all the curtains drawn so not one ray of light could shine in. Specks of dust floated by the beams of our rifles' flashlights as they scanned the interior. The house was immaculate, not a hair out of place, and it was still. So still. I couldn't help feeling a twinge of nostalgia as I looked around the typical kitschy decor of a 1970s family home. The thick, wood-paneled television set, the nicotine-stained wallpaper, the enormous grandfather clock, its hands frozen at 11:30. The living room and kitchen bore no signs of a struggle, none of the oddities seen throughout the zone, and more importantly, no bodies. "Captain Harp, this is Lieutenant Mayfield," I radioed in. "Nothing unusual so far. Structure isn't compromised and looks safe to enter." We split up to survey each room individually. I finished a thorough search of the kitchen and made my way to the main corridor to inspect the storage closet under the stairs. The door was wedged tight, but after 2 hard pulls it swung open to reveal chipped wood steps leading into darkness. While unusual for houses in this area to have basements, it wasn't completely unheard of. The strange part came when I instinctively tugged on the pull cord to my left and the room illuminated. "Captain, is this house still connected to the grid?" I asked. "Shouldn't be. The whole area was cut off before the wall went up." "What did you find?" Captain Harp answered. "The lighting in the basement still works." "Not the worst problem to have. Probably a separate battery-powered circuit. We've noted it down. Continue your search, Lieutenant." I took it slow, carefully testing my weight on each step before descending to the next. Halfway down, I saw a shadeless bulb hanging from a concrete ceiling, spilling light onto a grey and featureless room. In the center was a lopsided T-shaped cardboard box fort, plastered with scotch tape and decorated with crayon depictions of flowers and princesses. Apart from a few blankets and pillows, the little palace was empty. Still, something about it irked me, like this muted dungeon was no place for an artifact of childhood innocence. I shook off the feeling and told Richie and John to rendezvous at the front door before letting the scientists in. Much like us, the scientists couldn't find anything of significance. What was to be the focal point of the expedition turned up nothing of use, and we were left feeling dejected and increasingly worried for our health. We tried to eat that night, but we couldn't keep any food down. To avoid further deterioration, Captain Harp told us that the mission would be cut short after 2 more days of exploration. The reaction in the room was mixed. Myself, Amar, Richie, and John breathed a sigh of relief. We were tired of the cramps and uncanny atmosphere in the zone. Its end couldn't come sooner. Olga and Ian, on the other hand, were in disbelief. "How could you give up so soon, Captain?" Olga said. "We're no closer to understanding this place than before the expedition. We need a more thorough look at the epicenter. We need more samples, more time. We've found nothing." Michael straightened in his seat, his shaking leg finally becoming still. "Oh, I've found something," he cried. "The exact thing I was sent on this fool's errand for. I found the demons your generals were hoping for." He pointed a finger at Captain Harp. Voices, all crying, all screaming out from a swirling reservoir of souls deep, deep below that cursed house. That idiot girl found something she shouldn't have, and now we pay the price. Throughout this tirade, he grew more and more agitated, pacing back and forth, gesticulating violently. "Enough!" Captain Harp shouted. Michael didn't comply. Instead, moving closer to the captain, his voice grew to a crazed shout. "Tell them, Captain, tell them why I'm here." "Sit down, Michael, that's an order." When the captain gave this command, Michael swung, his fist connecting with the captain's jaw, springing me and the rest of the security escort into action. We closed the gap across the room and dogpiled Michael, quickly tying his arms behind his back and dragging him away from the rest of the group. We eventually gagged him in response to the endless, incoherent wailing. When the dust settled and our breathing slowed, our panic turned to suspicion. "Captain, what did he mean, tell us why he's here?" Ian asked. Captain Harp looked down, closed his eyes, and with a deep sigh said, "I knew there would be questions. I didn't like the idea, but the higher-ups were adamant. Michael is a theologist, not a meteorologist like you were told. He was sent to determine if the phenomena was of a supernatural nature." "You can't be serious," Olga scoffed. "Years of research, millions in funding, and your government taints it with this nonsense. This spits in the face of everything me and Ian have been doing here." "I didn't like it either, honest to God. This doesn't change anything and we all still have a job to do. It was more of an afterthought," the captain replied. For a tense minute, we all stood in that dimly lit community center hall. The scientists still wore a mild look of resentment. The rest of us tried to hide our concern, either spurred on by the revelation of Michael's true mission brief, or by simply questioning the salvageability of the expedition. I don't think any of us saw him creep up behind Captain Harp. One minute, he was tied up in the corner of the room. The next, he was behind the captain, unholstering his sidearm and sending a bullet ripping through the back of his neck at point-blank range. From the searing pain in our ears to the blood stinging our eyes, we didn't have time to react. Before we could draw our weapons, Michael had hooked 2 fingers deep into the captain's eye sockets and dragged him at an inhuman speed, down the street and straight towards number 32. We sprinted down the road trying to catch Michael, but in an instant he had passed the threshold of number 32 and the door slammed shut in front of us. I was second in command, but in that moment a coherent thought couldn't reach me. It had happened so fast. Within minutes the whole expedition collapsed in a way none of us could have imagined. Amar turned to me then. "Lewis, you need to make a decision." His voice pulled me from my stupor. I looked around to see that the whole expedition team accompanied me in my pursuit. "Amar, you and Richie stay with Ian and Olga. Don't move until you hear from me. John, suit up and help me get Michael," I ordered. We practically jumped into our suits, 2 feet first, zipped up each other's backs and ran through the plastic chamber, skipping the decontamination protocol. The house was even darker than before. The wallpaper was peeling, furniture lay splintered on the floor, a thick coating of dust over the wreckage. The trail of blood leading from the front door had branched off, snaking its way into every room, up every wall and the ceiling. We followed each path the blood took. I remember walking through the living room and seeing a faint wisp of smoke rising from the ashtray, disappearing just as I turned my head to focus on it. Waving my hand over it, I felt its warmth for a brief moment. I proceeded into the kitchen and was hit with the stench of rotting fruit and spoiled milk, but, like the cigarette smoked 30 years ago, the smell eluded me as soon as I noticed it. In some small way, those feelings were still there, existing in a plane separate to ours, not picked up by any senses, but by a place deep in the back of my mind. "Lewis, this place isn't right," John said, walking up next to me in the grimy kitchen. "I know, but we need to find Michael before we leave," I responded. "And Edward, we can't leave him here," John said, his voice sounding distant. "We'll get the captain out too, John, don't worry." There was one last place to look, the cold cement basement and its cardboard centerpiece. I dreaded the thought of going down there, looking into that box fort and seeing Michael's face glaring at me between the blankets and pillows. If only that was all that awaited me. I pulled open the door. It was noticeably looser this time. I once again instinctively pulled on the cord to my left. Only this time the lights wouldn't come on, and we were left to navigate down the uneven steps, guided only by our flashlights. Our lights scanned over the room, revealing old water-stained cardboard and cracked cement. As John approached the fort, 2 sets of arms shot out of the entrance, one set digging its fingers in between the knuckles of the other, controlling its each digit in jerking, spastic movements. I'd like nothing more than to think I warned John, called out or screamed or fired, but I'm not so sure I did anything at all. In reality, I stood rooted to the floor, speechless at the sight, if Michael clinging to the back of Captain Harp's corpse, manipulating his limbs, whispering into the captain's ear, and the captain whispering back. This amalgamation of the two rushed out of their cardboard hiding place. The captain's teeth sank into John's neck, causing him to slump back against the wall, his hand covering the wound. The creature turned its 2 heads to me and pounced before I could react. It pinned me down, and 2 sets of eyes stared deep into mine. One set was bloody and mashed, the other wide with a strange mix of fear and elation. Their gaze sent me tumbling down an abyss, the sights and sounds of the basement growing more and more distant the further I fell. The last thing I remember was hearing my own voice in a far-off place, telling Amar to bring the rest of the group into the house. I don't know how long I was in that condition for. It felt like I was plummeting downwards through a maelstrom of countless thoughts and emotions, most of which were not my own. I jolted awake, finding myself in pitch darkness, laying on a large bed. The air felt damp and I was surrounded by the acrid smell of sweat. After spending what felt like eternity in a senseless void, the odor hit me like a freight train and I tried hard not to vomit. For better or for worse, I needed to see my surroundings if I had any hope of understanding where I was. Neither my rifle nor sidearm was with me. I frisked myself, fumbling through every pouch, and eventually retrieved an emergency glow stick. I cracked it, letting the room be slowly blanketed in a dim green haze, and clipped it to my chest. It was the master bedroom. The bed I had just been laying on bore a large dark stain on its center. Clothes were strewn on the floor, ripped and clearly worn. I crept out of the bedroom and onto the upstairs landing. I peeked into the bathroom and immediately gagged at the sight and smell of the toilet. The plumbing had been shut off a long time ago, yet it was clear someone was living here, using the toilet. I quickly shut the door, but I found no respite from the smell. It seemed every corner of the house had its own distinct yet equally horrific scent. The damp mugginess of the bedroom, the mountain of fecal matter in the bathroom, and a deeply disturbing smell of rotting meat reaching me from downstairs. A faint muttering below me focused my thoughts away from the stench. My whole body stiffened as I tried to identify the sound. The words were frantic and repetitive, but what language it was I couldn't tell. Deciding to investigate, I placed one foot down the stairs. The step creaked, almost deafening in the house's oppressive silence. The muttering stopped. "Is someone there? Show yourself," Amar's voice croaked from downstairs. "Amar, is that you?" I replied. His voice was almost unrecognizable, tired yet manic. I hurried down the rest of the steps, and Amar's face came into view under the glow stick's light. His beard was damp and unkempt, his eyes sunken and glassy. He shed his uniform and was now wearing what I assumed were clothes he had found in the house, equally as disheveled and stained as the ones I had seen in the bedroom. The only thing that seemed in relative order was his turban. "Lewis! My God, Lewis, how... Is that really you?" Amar asked, his voice trembling, his eyes flooding with tears. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. What had I missed when I was knocked out? "Yes, Amar, yes, it's me. What happened? Where's Richie and John? Where are the scientists?" He fell to the floor and began sobbing when I asked this. I pulled him to his feet and attempted to snap him out of his hysteria. I wished now that I had just let him grieve, to find some emotional outlet amidst the chaos. "So long. I've been here for so long. We're trapped, Lewis. The house won't let us leave," Amar cried. I ran to the front door, pulling, kicking. It was no use. The door gave no hint of opening. I turned to Amar, his back now to the kitchen door. "There's no way out, Lewis. I tried everything," he said. "What do you mean there's no way out?" I shouted back, resentful of Amar's supposed apathy towards our situation. "How long have you been here for?" "Months, maybe." "It's hard to tell," Amar replied. "Doors are sealed, windows too. We couldn't smash them. The outside, Lewis. There's nothing outside." When the flashlights had batteries, we could find our way around the house, but when we shone them out the windows, nothing. What do you mean we, Amar? Are the others here too? He reeled back at the question, back firmly against the kitchen door, his arms spread to block my entry. No, 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 he repeated, his head shaking from left to right so quickly I thought he'd snap his stick-thin, emaciated neck. Amar, what's in the kitchen? I asked cautiously. My question stopped his maniacal protest, and his gaze bore into me. In that hallway, under the glow stick's hue, Amar resembled nothing of the man I once knew and admired. We needed you, Lewis. We were lost, trapped, confused, and we needed you. And only now you decide to show yourself. As he was talking, he drew a knife from the back of his waistband. He lunged at me. God, he was so light, so frail. I dodged the knife with ease and threw him to the ground, cringing at the sound his joints made as they hit the wood floor. I kicked the knife away and shouldered through the kitchen door as he lay gasping for breath. Of all the memories I no longer possess, why does this one have to remain perfectly clear? They were my brothers, people I served with for years and would protect with my life. I saw their decayed, butchered remains lying there in the kitchen, only recognizable by their dog tags and neatly folded uniforms on the counter. I walked to the counter and pocketed the 2 dog tags. Amar limped into the kitchen, his face contorted, tears streaming into his filthy beard. You have no idea what we've been through. John was already dying when we found ourselves here. That thing wearing Michael's skin severed his carotid artery. We didn't want to. I swear to you, we tried for so long not to. The days and weeks blended together in this darkness until our only sense of time came from the pain in our stomachs. Then Richie, he tried to escape. I kept telling him that a fate worse than ours awaited him down there, but he persisted. I killed him so he wouldn't go down there. I saved him, Lewis. I think deep down I knew what he was talking about. I could feel it ever since waking up in this place, a tugging in the back of my mind, a gentle pull towards the basement. Amar, I have to leave. I tried to sound as gentle as I could. I no longer knew what the man across from me was capable of. He was practically a bag of bones, but unpredictable. He stood swaying in the kitchen doorway, nearly unable to support his own weight. I have to go down there, we both do. We can't stay here forever, you of all people should know that, I said in the most disarming tone I could muster. Amar kept swaying, shaking his head slightly as he pondered my statement. I have done horrible things, Lewis. I've killed my friend, consumed his flesh and doomed myself to a wretched life in perpetual darkness, all because I alone know what awaits us if we go deeper. It's evil, Lewis, an evil that dwarfs my misdeeds. I can't let you go down there. He closed the gap in an instant, jumping on me and slamming me to the floor with a strength I didn't know any human could possess, let alone this starved and withered prisoner. I managed to move my leg past his hips and kicked upwards as hard as I could. Amar reeled back, blood and rotted teeth spilling from his mouth. I scrambled to my feet, half sprinting, half stumbling out of the kitchen to the basement door. As I swung the door open, Amar grabbed my ankle in a vice grip, sending both of us tumbling down the basement stairs. I landed hard on my shoulder and felt the joint pop out of place. Amar fell directly on his face, his cheekbone meeting the concrete floor with a wet crunch. I didn't pause for a second and crawled towards the opening of the box fort with one arm, the other dragging uselessly on the ground. At the far end of the cardboard tunnel, I spotted a hole, a ring of frayed cardboard surrounding a black abyss. I squeezed further in, the old dry cardboard burning my elbows. I chanced one look behind me, seeing Amar's broken and bloody face staring back, before tipping forward head first into the hole. I can't recall how long I was falling for. All I remember was the sting of the rough concrete tearing through my uniform, the dull ache left behind after hitting against the occasional piece of wayward rebar. I thought that I'd eventually fall deep enough to reach dirt or even some natural stone, but the house's foundation just kept stretching downwards. At some point during my endless descent, I let my mind drift, thoughtless and at peace. I barely registered that I was no longer falling, but was now being constricted on all sides by the tunnel, the space behind me narrowing, the space in front widening, squeezing me further down the concrete esophagus. As the tunnel tightened around my chest, leaving me gasping for air, I wept. Not for myself, but for Amar. I wished I did more for him. I should have killed him, granting him an escape before I crawled into my own claustrophobic prison, but instead I permitted him to suffer. dooming him to wither away in that dark house alone with nothing but the stripped corpses of his friends accompany him in his final hours. My remorseful thoughts gradually faded into sweet unconsciousness, and when I awoke, I was once again in the master bedroom of number 32 Fermi Park Road. As I'd come to expect, the house's appearance was once again altered from its last incarnation. I think my time spent in that strange place gave me some intimate subconscious knowledge of its nature, because as I surveyed my new surroundings, limping out of the bedroom, I knew that this was its true form. The previous houses just after images formed by its journey to where it was now. The borders distinguishing objects from their neighbors seemed to blend together, their colors shifting ever so slightly, almost like the construction I now walked through was not firmly set in the material world, but rebuilt from numerous contradictory memories of the place. A humming rippled through the air with no discernible source, and the faint smell of ozone lingered in my nose. With every step, a different voice penetrated my mind. "Weather's supposed to be good today." I walked down the steps, gripping the banister. "Stick on the kettle, would you?" Every surface I touched sent a warm vibration through me. "Mummy, why did we have to move?" The couch in the living room constantly shifted places, unsure if it was facing the fireplace or the television. "Why don't you play in the basement while I get dinner ready? I left some boxes there for you." Play in the basement. Basement. I was moving on autopilot, nudged along either by an unseen force or my own morbid curiosity. I took my time going down the basement steps, careful not to trip on their ever-changing geometry. What I found down there was not a series of boxes crudely taped together, but the source of the intrusive voices. A mound of writhing flesh pulsated in the center of the basement, dotted with orifices that would open, spew out a stranger's memory in a stranger's voice before closing back up. Standing beside it, amidst a heap of frantically written notes and sketches, were Olga and Ian. "How fitting of you to join us at the conclusion of our research," Ian said, unfazed at my entrance. "I thought you two were dead," I finally said, overcoming my paralyzing shock. "Oh no, we've just been here for quite some time, studying," Ian replied. "Learning," Olga added. "How did you get here? I thought I was the only one left," I gasped. "Same as you, I think. We needed to know more. That drive led us here," Olga explained. They moved from their position and began pacing around me. "Like an object in orbit, it's either close enough to eventually be pulled in, succumbing to the effects of gravity," Ian explained, "or it is far enough for it to get flung away," Olga continued. Their movements and speech were perfectly synchronized. Each sentence they started was finished by the other, in an almost rehearsed fashion. "So we were pulled in, and we listened, to many voices and even more experiences. The girl was our favorite," Olga said. "A girl who saw the most amazing thing in her little makeshift home in the basement," Ian cooed. "A thing not of this world. A thing that, while only intruding into this plane for not even a nanosecond, left a shadow scorched onto the universe. I'm sure you felt its effects, Lewis. Thought. Material. The boundaries between the two now inconsequential, flowing freely, unhindered by the limits of our reality." They completed their lap around me, meeting in the middle and combining like two drops of oil floating on water, before splitting off and resuming their pacing. All of those lucky enough to be drawn in now reside here, their respective minds contributing to a well of sentience. We still have so much to learn from it. You can join us, or you can keep fighting it and dig deeper. Journey past infinity and see where you end up. As they said this, they joined hands and stepped into the mass of flesh, merging seamlessly with the monstrosity. I was frozen in place, battling not only with my incomprehensible experiences, but the mental barrage of countless minds probing their way into my own. With all the strength I could muster, I forced myself to look around the room, hopelessly searching for a way out. And there, tucked between folds of skin and hair, was a small opening, in the exact same position as my previous escape route. I was broken, mentally and physically. My limbs were weak, my flesh was bruised, and my thoughts still in a faraway place, doing their best to not register the absurdity of the situation. So, with nothing left to lose, I slipped one foot in, then the other, feeling the opening pucker around my shins and pull me in. I think it was here that my mind was truly broken. The voices were a cacophony of screaming, actively trying to pry their way into my psyche. I sank further down the tunnel of flesh with my eyes tightly shut, the voices growing more and more demanding, commanding me to join them. I couldn't. No matter how badly I wanted this torment to end, I just couldn't let them in. The shared experiences of countless victims shot through my brain, memories that I never had, lifetimes that I never lived passed by as if they were my own. I spent an eternity in that prison of skin, flesh and bone, and somewhere along the way I discarded what was left of my mind in a feeble attempt to survive. When I opened my eyes and found that I was once again in the master bedroom, I cried out in agony, thinking that my punishment was not yet over and instead moving on to an even more horrific stage. But something was different this time around. Streaks of sunlight flooded through the curtains, and I was met with the smell of fresh air. There was no bed, no furniture at all, except for the occasional stepladder or toolbox. I timidly walked through the house, although I encountered nothing out of the ordinary. Sheets of cloth were draped over the wooden floors, and patches of fresh paint covered the bare walls. I shuffled to the front door, and my heart skipped a beat as I undid the latch and the door opened freely. I wandered through the streets with the crook of my elbow blocking the sun from my eyes. After some time I must have raised suspicions, because I was eventually brought to the institution I now call home. I don't think what I experienced was the result of malicious intent. That thing was neither good nor evil, it simply existed, giving no heed to life forms like me, whose plane of existence were leagues below its own. I'm not quite sure why I'm writing this all down. I think in some way it memorializes my team members, even if this place has no memory of an exclusion zone in North London or of any catastrophe that occurred here. There's an orderly here who has always been kind to me. I think I'll give these scraps of paper to her. I trust she'll know what to do with them. It was hard not to look at the pale, doughy man sat across from me with utter contempt. Hatred, even. His entire frame seemed to roil and bubble with each shuddered and exasperated breath. Beads of sweat cascaded down his bald head, rounding his jiggling jowls and the folds of his neck, dampening the tightly buttoned collar of his too small dress shirt. He fiddled with the handcuff encased around his pudgy wrist, fondling it with his sausage fingers. He'd raised the cuffed arm slightly, exposing a swiftly growing puddle of condensation in the space where his hairless forearm had rested on the metal table. That slick sheen of sweat caused his pallid skin to glow under the halogen lights above our heads. Edwin Taller. The sick fuck looked like a giant soft-boiled egg. Taller had been on the department's radar for a good while. He had a few priors for lewd behavior in his younger days, had been caught skulking around outside the middle school. There was even a local rumor in St. Clair that he'd run around in the middle of the night with an undersized children's private school uniform barely fitted over his fat frame, yelling excitedly about the school year and all the friends he hoped to make. I know it's best not to judge a book by its cover, but you could tell just by looking at the guy. Something upstairs wasn't right. The problem with these cases is making something stick. You've got to track these pieces of shit for weeks, months, following their perverted digital footprint, ensuring you got all the hard evidence you possibly could of their despicable tastes. A fake profile, an internet chat room. It didn't take much for our officer to coax Taller into exposing himself, speaking freely of all the little girls he'd done things to, what he wanted to do to her, a 13-year-old, by the fake age we'd listed on the profile and reiterated repeatedly during our talks with Taller, providing visual aids all the while. We finally kicked the motherfucker's door in at 6:30 that morning, and it had been worse than we could have imagined. The worst part wasn't Taller's questionable taste in art, the cartoon drawings and black and white photos of children that adorned his walls. It wasn't the gigabytes upon gigabytes of illicit material we found on Taller's devices once we'd dragged him out of the dingy apartment, handcuffed and blubbering like a plate of flan. The worst part was the girl he'd been on top of when that door splintered to bits. A pale mountain of flesh in skid-marked tighty whities, straddling an unconscious waifish thing on a dirty mattress. As of now, several hours later, she still hadn't woken up. Which brought us to this moment. Taller stared off into space, still sweating despite the room's near frigid temperature, still pawing at his handcuffed wrist. I slapped the table, hard. The sound of flesh on cold metal reverberated through the room. Taller jumped, handcuff rattling, chair nearly falling over backwards. He seemed to jiggle faster now, like the fear and adrenaline elicited a physical response. "Listen, Edwin," I started, my voice a low growl. "We've got you dead to rights. We've got your messages with our agent, the one that you thought was a 13-year-old. Taller's white face reddened with shame. "You were on top of that poor girl. We've looked at your computer. We can sit here and play with ourselves for all I care, but if you've got any interest in making things even a little better for yourself, now's the time to start cooperating." Tala kept his eyes downcast, fixed on the floor, his shaky breathing the only response to my tirade. The truth was, we did need the fat man to start spilling his guts. So far, we hadn't been able to find any information on the girl while she remained in his unconscious state. She didn't match the physical description of any missing kids in any local municipalities. Until she came to, Tala was our only shot at getting anything. "The girl," I shouted. "Where did she come from? Who is she?" A grimace crossed Tala's face. His round head began to shake from side to side. Finally, he spoke. "I guess she's still asleep then." The large man's voice was soft and meek, with an otherworldly effeminate quality. I raised an eyebrow. Suddenly, he snapped his face forward to lock eyes with me. "Is she here? Is she at the hospital?" His voice became frenzied, eyes going wild. Tala made a move to stand, shifting the entire table as he did so. The veins in his neck bulged as his eyes darted around the room. I jumped to my feet, rushing over and grabbing his free arm to force him back down. "Hey!" I screamed. "Sit your fucking ass down, motherfucker!" His arm was damp with sweat and felt malleable, like wet clay. Tala did as he was told, but that manic look didn't leave his eyes. "Please, please," he murmured as he returned to a seated position. "You have to keep her mouth covered. Keep her eyes closed. Keep her restrained. Ah." I sneered at him in disgust, fighting the urge to rear back and rearrange some of his teeth. "Because," Tala continued, his voice catching in his throat, "if she wakes up, everyone's going to die." I scoffed, unable to help myself. "Is that a threat?" "Please, sir," he continued, pleading his case. "Please, you have to believe me. I know I've been bad. I know I've been a bad man. But that girl—" Tears welled in Tala's eyes. He was crazier than I thought. I figured my usual strong-arm approach wasn't going to do me any good. I needed him to start spewing. Hopefully I'd be able to get my licks in later on, once the situation was a little more under our control. "Listen, Edwin." I released my grip on his arm and made my way back to the other side of the table. Tala cradled his shiny head in his free hand. "We want to help her. We want to figure out what's going on, who she is. She's been taken to the hospital. We have officers with her and doctors working. We're all hoping she wakes up." Tala began shaking his head. I continued. "I'm not going to insult your intelligence. It's not looking good for you. But listen, you tell us what happened. A bit about her. That cooperation could help you in the long run. I know you can tell us who she is. Edwin, what's her name?" Tala began mumbling to himself. "If she's at the hospital, then maybe she won't." Hey, I interrupted. "Edwin, come on, focus." Tala still kept his eyes averted, but he spoke clearly. "Once I met her, once I saw her, I just couldn't. I've never been able to. They're just so beautiful when they're like that. Like her. That's all I've ever wanted." I sucked my teeth, keeping my comments and my hands to myself. "Sir Lana." The word left his mouth after a beat. I waited for him to continue. He didn't. "What is that? What does that mean?" "It's her name," the Eggman finally answered. "That's her name. She's not right. She's not from this place." "Jesus fucking Christ," I muttered. "Didn't you people notice?" Tala continued. "When you took her, when you got her to the hospital, her skin, it's so grey. Her arms and legs, her fingers, they're longer than ours. Maybe at first, maybe you can't see it. But the lounger you look at her, and her mouth, her teeth, her eyes." I thought about what he was saying. Truth told, I hadn't looked that closely at the girl when we'd rescued her from Tala's clutches earlier in the day. The scene had been an absolute madhouse, and she had been quickly shuffled into an ambulance. To what I could recollect, her skin certainly hadn't been vibrant and glowing, but she'd been living in hellish conditions for God knew how long. No one would look healthy under those circumstances. But elongated digits and limbs, an unnatural mouth. Tala was off his fucking rocker. "She's not like us. They're not like us." I ran my hand over my face in confused exasperation. Tala continued. "That's why I had to keep her sedated, keep her eyes covered, because if I didn't, she'd be able to call out to her mother." Tala let the words hang in the air a moment. "I shouldn't have taken her. When we talked, when we spoke, I fell in love. I've always wanted to love a girl like her. But when I saw what she was, met her mother, I should have left it alone." My mouth contorted into an expression of disgust and further confusion as Tala slowly raised his head, a look of pure anguish on his face. Anguish, or fear. Haven't you ever done anything stupid for love? I couldn't help it. I nearly leapt over the table and grabbed Tala by the scruff of his shirt with one hand and wrapped the other around his pudgy neck. I don't love little girls, you sick fuck. The fat Eggman wriggled like jello as his cold sweat flopped in all directions. I glanced up at the interrogation room's camera. I really didn't need another incident like this going on my record. I'd always had trouble keeping my cool when it came to pieces of shit like Tala. Slapping them in cuffs and sending them on their way after a comfortable interview never felt like punishment enough. I tightened my grip as he sputtered. No more games, no more fucking bullshit. I tried to hear you out and you're hitting me back with some nonsense. Let's focus on the parts that make sense. You talked. When? Where? How? You met this girl's mother? Get your shit together and tell me the whole fucking story. Tala swallowed hard. Detective, please. He softly wheezed out the words. Please just call them. The hospital, wherever she is. Tell them to keep her eyes and mouth covered. Keep her sedated. Please. I'll tell you the whole story, just please. I shook my head, not loosening my grasp on his neck. Talk first. He bared his teeth in a frustrated grimace, but shook his head, best he could while being strangled. Yes. I let him go, returning to my seat. Tala rubbed his neck, letting out a few hacking coughs. I upturned both palms and spread my arms, gesturing in front of me, a silent command to begin. Tala sighed, rubbing a clammy hand over his face. A wave of hot air that stunk like milk wafted over me. We messaged on one of those internet chat sites, an art forum. That was a place where I liked to... His sentence trailed off as his white skin turned flush. Well, I was on there a lot, and we both commented on the same photo. She replied to a comment that I left. The drawing it was a naked girl. Disgust oozed from every one of my pores. I can show you, Tala offered lamely. Later, I sternly replied. Keep talking. He shook his head. Well, the comment I left was a heart, and saying how beautiful I thought the picture was. She answered me. She replied to me, telling me how she could look like that. I scoffed. Sick fuck, I muttered under my breath. Tala grimaced but kept on, immersing himself in the story. I sent her a message. In her inbox, a DM. She answered back. From the beginning, I could just tell that something about her was different. It wasn't right. Her profile picture on the forum, it was just a black square. If you enlarged it, though, it was like you could make out this faint outline. I don't know how to describe it. Detective, I could tell that it wasn't a black JPEG, solid color. It was a picture of something, somewhere. I don't know what. I stared at that picture a lot, before she and I actually met. When we'd message and the chat was open, I stared at that void. It was like something emanated from it, even though it was just a picture on my screen. The fat man stopped speaking and cocked his head slightly, shifting the blobbed rolls of his neck. I leaned forward in my chair, awaiting his next move. Tala shut his eyes hard and resumed after a pregnant pause. Something was there, but I guess now I'll never know what it really was. I can see it, though, when I close my eyes tight like that. The something. It's like a call, a hypnotic song from somewhere else. He phrased the end of his statement like a question. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued by the psycho fuck's babbling, but the story was getting a bit long in the tooth. Let's stay on topic, Tala. Get back to you and her. The messages. Tala silently shook his head in affirmation, then went on. When I messaged her the first time since her picture was that, I asked her age. Asked her if she really could look like the girl in that drawing. She answered back almost immediately, like she was waiting for it, said she was 14, and her name was Solana. I'd never heard a name like that before, Detective. I asked where she was from, what it meant. She never told me. Solana would use these words that were just wrong and strange. She'd tell me about her house where she lived with her mother and how it was so cold and made of concrete, and that it was infested with skrells. The Korak was rising, and that meant her mother was having a difficult time. It was like she was from some made-up foreign country that didn't actually exist, and she'd never explain what any of the things like that she talked about meant. One night, she messaged me nearly 20 times in a row, non-stop, saying the same thing over and over. Tivurk won't stop screaming. My jaw hung slack in disbelief. Edwin, I started. It sounds like this kid was fucking with you, talking nonsense and saying weird things. How did you find out who she really was, where she lived? Why buy into this shit?" Tala scratched the top of his fleshy head. "That's what I figured, Detective, at first. I mean, I'll be honest here. All of our cards are on the table, right? She's not... Well, Solana wasn't the first girl I ever spoke to, and even with all of the strangeness, the reason I got so wrapped up was when I saw her. The first picture she sent me. That first night. I asked her what she looked like. Told her I liked pretty girls like her. I sent her some photos of myself first and, well, eventually she answered. The first picture she sent was blurry, out of focus, barely recognizable, a grey smear on a stark black abyss. I asked her to hold the camera steady, told her how badly I wanted to see her. The next image was more clear. Tala trailed off again. The fat piece of shit was clearly having a hard time keeping his thoughts organized. In that picture I could see her, Solana in all her beauty. Her skin was pallid, grey. Her arms seemed to bend at an unnatural angle, like she wasn't really sure how to hold the camera for a selfie. Wild hair was unbrushed and frayed in all directions, but it was her face that drew me in. Her eyes, they were tinted yellow, slightly bloodshot, and rimmed with deep black bags, cheeks sunken and bony. Her gaze was startlingly intense. Her black and yellow eyes bore a hole right into the camera, but there was still a youthfulness to her. Detective. Something about her was wrong, but I could see a girl who needed something. I blew air out my nostrils in disgust. What happened next? Get to the part where you kidnapped her like the sick fuck you are. Tala stared into space, not even seeming to absorb what I said. I could sense this need in her eyes, defective, a want for something that you can't really place or describe, something taboo, unearthly. Something about it. I felt like I related to her. I've always felt different too. "Don't start with that poor me shit," I interrupted. "You're not getting any sympathy from me. You're a pedophile, Tala. If this were a proper country, you'd be strung up in the middle of the street downtown." The egg fuck actually smiled, sad and weak. It was everything in me not to leap across the table again. I know how everyone feels. I'm not a moron. But I felt like she and I just had this instantaneous connection. We're both not right. I told her I thought she was beautiful, and how she looked sad and lost, and like she needed someone. She told me she did. Told me about her house and her mother and how awful things were. We got to talking almost every day. I guess the specifics don't all really matter. You can check my phone to see for yourself. We sent each other pictures. We poured our hearts out. She told me how sad she was, how rotten life was, that she lived in the dusk and the grey, and that she wanted to meet a man who could take her away from the Vakrel and the Chothins, away from her mother. It makes no sense, Detective. She's speaking terrifying nonsense, spending me ominous photos, but I couldn't get her out of my mind. I needed her. I didn't think her mother could be that bad. I could sense that the grand tale was reaching some sort of climax. I furrowed my brow and kept my comments to myself this time. Tala's skin glistened with sweat like a roasting pig as he continued on. I finally told her I needed to meet, to really see her. She told me she was ready. The address she gave me, it was that old cemetery, just outside of St. Clair in Forest City, the abandoned crematorium. I went anyway. I know no one lives there. An intense look suddenly crossed Tala's face, like something inside of him hardened. He narrowed his eyes and held my gaze in a way that put me on edge. In a moment, it was like a switch flipped and he turned the tables on the room's energy. "Detective, can you seriously say you've never wanted something you weren't supposed to have, and you wanted it to be true so badly that you were going to get it no matter how the reality of the situation looked?" I tried to stay firm in my response, but I felt sweat suddenly forming on my brow. "I'm the one interrogating you, Edwin. Finish your fucking story." Tala nodded. I drove there on a Saturday. It was hazy, overcast. The air was dry and freezing. I saw my breath when I got out of the car. That old cemetery. It's still got a fully accessible parking lot. It's overgrown and the cement's all cracked, but you can get in. You can enter into this other world. Forgotten death. I saw the crematorium looming behind the overgrown bushes and trees on the untended grounds as I walked up the winding dirt path from the parking lot. The path cut through the graveyard itself, and plenty of dirt caked and weather-beaten gravestones jutted up from the sea of vines and wild grass. There wasn't a single sound in the air, Detective. The birds and the animals and all, they abandoned that place too. Why couldn't it have been some other girl? You're thinking that, right? Why did it have to be her? Because it did. Emptiness should have surrounded me on all sides, but it felt like something was there. Again, just this hypnotizing and ominous pull. The place had been left behind by all of us, and turned into something it shouldn't have. Halfway between the parking lot and the crematorium, I saw her. I was practically on the edge of my seat now, sweat ice cold and squinting with disbelief, waiting with bated breath to hear what Tala would say next. She sort of crawled out from the grass, the side of the path, the actual grave sites. On all fours she wriggled into the dirt. Her strange limbs and awkward proportions looked more pronounced in person. She didn't look nearly as human, as normal. All she wore was a ragged brown dress, looking almost like a potato sack. No shoes, no jewelry. Slowly, she rose to her feet and turned to face me. Wild, greasy hair hung over her face, but I could still make out those yellow-tinged eyes. You probably think I was terrified, Detective, but in that moment, honestly, I still wanted her. I asked if it was her, if she was Solana. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me and smiled really wide, wider than a person can. "Don't you want to meet Mother?" Her voice was not what I expect, gravelly and distant. I took a step toward her, trying to close the gap. I couldn't help myself, I reached out and grabbed her. Tala's eyes took on a manic quality as the story continued. The second I did that, she opened her mouth in a giant O and let out this agonizing, ear-splitting scream. Thinking about it even now, it makes my head hurt. It wasn't a noise that a human being could make, Detective. I kept hold of her arm, but I stumbled, and then I felt it. This great rumbling in the earth, like some giant creature moving. I looked up and saw it. Well, sort of, from further up the path. Some giant dark shape was beelining for us. It shuddered and shook, and it was almost like I couldn't focus on it even as I stared right at it. But it was massive, and it was coming straight for me. There was this smell, this damp, earthy and organic stink, right in the back of my throat so I could taste it. I should have just taken off, I should have run away, but I wanted her. I wanted Solana. It's like I said before, Detective, about wanting something so bad that you'd do anything. Nothing in that moment made any sense except the feelings I've always carried with me. I thought I loved her. I thought fast. I yanked Solana by the arm and dragged her with me as I ran. I couldn't hear, but I felt the thing gaining. Mother. There was a rusted and bent gap in the iron bars that lined the cemetery along the dirt path. I dove through and somehow we fit. I think it threw the thing off. We kept moving, into the tall grass and trying not to trip over headstones. Solana scratched and clawed at me, but she wasn't strong enough. I glanced back again to see the frantic shape bounding over the iron bars. I had an idea. I suddenly stopped in my tracks and grabbed Solana's neck with my free hand. I strangled her, hard as I could. I squeezed her neck with all my might. Her cry was cut short, turned to a whimper, and it stopped. I turned to see that her mother had stopped again in its tracks. It was still some black and shimmering blur, but it wasn't racing toward me anymore. I'm not stupid, Detective, I understood. I looked into Solana's eyes. A twisted and hateful expression had crossed her face as strangled cries scraped her throat. I knew I could love her. I kept my hand around her neck and bashed her head into one of the tombstones 2, 3 times, till her eyes closed and her jaw went slack, till it was safe to let go of her throat. I didn't want to kill her. I didn't look back at her mother again. I was terrified that one wrong move would be the end. Cutting off that sound seemed to work. It was like, I'm not sure if that's the way they communicated, or if Solana was the one giving her mother the orders. She had certainly been telling the truth about her mother being a difficult person to live with. I took the long way out of the cemetery and wrapped Solana up with some duct tape I had in the trunk. We went home. I know you're judging me, but she was mine. She'd called me there, even encountering her mother, even all the wrongness and weirdness. She was mine. I needed her. I'd never meet another girl like her. When I got her back to the apartment, I kept her on a steady diet of Xanax and other sedatives. I didn't want to risk what would happen if she woke up, but I loved her so much. Our time together, it really was paradise. Then you guys kicked in my door. Even having Solana wasn't enough, I guess. I wanted more. Fell for your little trick. I have no idea what they are. Detective, I've told you everything I can. She's probably awake by now, And everyone at that hospital is probably dead. So Tala went silent and stared at me expectantly. I had let him rant uninterrupted for all that time, and sat in stunned and silent disbelief now that the story had come to an end. What the fuck was I supposed to say? Almost as if on cue, the sound of my cell phone's ringtone suddenly cut into the room, disturbing the silence. I instantly knew before I picked up the call that something wasn't right. It just couldn't be. I clicked answer. I was immediately met with the sounds of screaming and pure chaos. The call had come from my partner, Nielsen. He'd taken the girl over to the hospital. He'd been waiting for her to wake up. But on the other end, I didn't immediately hear him. I heard people screaming, sirens blaring, anarchy and insanity. Then, Nielsen's shaky and panicked voice. "Brand new," he mumbled. "Alex." It was all I could muster. His first name. "It's that girl. It's..." Nielsen trailed off, sounding lost and terrified. "I don't know what happened. She woke up, and then she started screaming, almost like her jaw unhinged and this awful noise spewed out, a whine that pierced our ears. There was that same spacey and tinny quality to his voice. "Alex," I interrupted, trying again. "What's wrong? Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "Her mother," he answered. "It came here. There's so much blood. Tony, it's like when your shower backs up and you stand in that inch of water." "Alex!" I yelled, trying to gain control. I kept my eyes locked with Tala, my expression twisting into anguished rage. "Alex, you gotta tell me what happened to you. And what did what did it look like? What was it?" "I don't think I have a face anymore." Nielsen's sole response. I heard more screams, more panic and horror, as the line went dead. My entire body trembled as I placed the phone on the metal table. Tala had a look of genuine sympathy, mixed with fear, plastered on his fat mug. "I tried to tell you," he offered lamely. I shook my head but said nothing, shock and disbelief overtaking me. "Detective, we don't know when it's coming here. Whatever it is, we could call the National Guard. We could call someone. We can get away." I ran my hand over my face, frustration and fear building. Tala had been telling the fucking truth. That was the only option. I just knew now that he was right. Those things would be coming here, whatever they were. Solana and her mother, they hadn't gotten what they wanted to begin with, and now we'd pissed them off even more. Maybe we still had the chance to get away. I stood, walking over to Tala as I readied the handcuff keys to set him free. A flash of hope crossed the Eggman's face. I stopped. I stared at him, in all his foul and pasty repulsiveness, a disgusting paedophile who'd caused all of this. I thought about everything he'd said that day, everything he'd done, the way his body had looked, hunched over the girl as we yanked him off, the reason we'd been onto him in the first place. All those photos, all those kids, everyone he'd hurt, participated in the hurting of. The man who'd wanted a little girl so badly that he stole one from a monster. I put the keys back in my pocket. Tala's face sunk. He knew instantly. His mouth fell agape in terror, eyes opened wide. "No," he murmured, repeating the word as it rose to a scream. "No, detective, please." Tala made to stand, the metal interrogation table shifting and scraping on the concrete floor as he did so. I said nothing, beelining for the door as fat fingers grazed the back of my shirt, iron-willed and ignoring Tala's desperate pleas. The man had screwed with forces far beyond our comprehension. He'd cost God knew how many people their lives that day. I heard it as I was slamming the interrogation room door shut, locking it behind me. A piercing wail in the distance, a sound like knitting needles being driven into my eardrums. I cupped my ears with my hands as the noise quickly became unbearable even from this distance. I heard screams too, and the thumping, clawing steps of gargantuan legs. A crash and splintering wood as the front door of the station was blasted through. The sounds intensified, my colleagues yelling in terror, sharp claws rending into flesh, and that damn siren's cry, an organic alarm guiding these horrible things where they needed to go. Solana rounded the corner first. She looked different than she had this morning when we'd pulled her from her captivity. Haggard, sure, but more determined. Wide yellow eyes, frantic and focused. She hobbled toward me on spindly legs, gesturing at me with her bony fingers as her mouth grew wider and wider. The source of the horrible noise coming deep from the back of her throat. It looked like the corners of her mouth were upturned in a malicious smile. I felt a rumbling from behind her, as a twisted and lumbering shadow was cast from around the bend in the hallway. A smell wafted to my nostrils as the mother grew closer, filling the room. A scent like a predator, the cat house at the zoo, animalistic and metallic. It smelled like the jungle. I held my hands up frantically to Solana, screaming at her to stop, unsure if she'd be able to hear me over her own droning wail, or even understand me if she could. The grey girl tilted her head quizzically and closed her mouth. The encroaching shadow from beyond the wall came to a dead stop. Solana stared at me with those yellow eyes, silently commanding me to speak. "In there!" I pointed to the door behind me. My ears were ringing. I could barely hear my own voice even as I spoke. I could faintly make out Tala's muffled cries, the sound of a fat and wet palm desperately slapping against the inside of the door. Solana looked at the door, then back to me. "The man, the one you're looking for." Something crossed over the girl thing's face, a glint of understanding. They weren't human, sure, and who knew what their intentions had been in the first place? But at the core, I couldn't get that image out of my head. A creature hunched over and taking advantage of someone weaker. Solana wasn't the monster in that scene. I'd said all I could. My fate was in their hands now. Whatever the fuck these things were, whatever was waiting around that corner. I had no shot against it if they decided they wanted to rip my face off too. An eternity passed as I waited. "Close your eyes." Solana's voice was ragged and chalky, strangled, like the words didn't come naturally at all. She didn't sound like a little girl. A smile too wide for her face grew to split the skin as she continued. "Mother doesn't like it when they see." With that, she opened her mouth into another giant O, and that awful wailing started again. What choice did I have? I closed my eyes, covered my ears to drown the sound out best I could. I felt that rumbling again, heard giant footsteps slamming closer. A wave of nausea passed over me as that jungle stench got even closer. A hulking and threatening presence lingered near me for several moments. Solana's mother deciding my fate. Part of me wanted to open my eyes, see what kind of hideous monstrosity this thing was, a morbid curiosity to see something that humans weren't meant to. You know what they say about curiosity. I didn't hear them tear the door off its hinges. Didn't hear Tala's desperate and pathetic cries of agony as whatever the fuck the mother was tore into the fleshy Eggman and ripped him to shreds, stringing his organs up like Christmas lights. It was all drowned out by Solana's agonizing cry. I wondered if they felt satisfaction, revenge, or were they just feeding some kind of hunger? The way I looked at it, these things came from some place adjacent to ours, a place we're not supposed to know about. They cast the lure and Tala bit. But he was a little too smart, a little too much of a monster himself, made theirs and all of our lives a little more terrible. It took a moment for me to realize that the rumbling and the screaming had stopped. My ears were ringing once again. The entire world moved in slow motion. I didn't look into Tala's room. I stumbled through the hallway and around the corner, vision blurred. The entire station had been ripped apart. I dropped to my knees and vomited as I exited the open wall of the station where the front doors used to be, and into the grey daylight of winter. Mass chaos and commotion played out all around me. People screamed and cried, sirens wailed. There was a coppery and blood-drenched haze hanging in the atmosphere, where Solana and her mother walked their path of destruction. I took a deep, deep breath. The air smelled like freedom.